This video guide is for installing GDAL onto a Windows machine. And in this video guide, we're going to just quickly touch on what GDAL is and why we want to actually do the install onto a Windows machine, as opposed to just using a GIS package like QGIS to do the install of GDAL. So to get started, just a quick overview of GDAL. So it's the Geospatial Data Abstraction Library, and it works within many different GIS packages, QGIS, ArcGIS. R uses GDAL also in certain instances. And importantly, it works with both vector and raster. So we can see in this diagram here, we have our spatial data and then GDAL, and then GDAL is sort of the intermediate between the GIS software packages. And the GDAL project is embedded in those installs. If we want to just do GDAL and have it accessible on our command line or command prompt, we can also do that. And that gives us a lot of flexibility in terms of how we operate with spatial data, reading it, writing it, translating it, transforming it. So we want to go ahead and get the install done correctly. So I'm going to use this post, GDAL, why is it useful, and what is it, and how to install it. And the first part is installing on Mac OS. I'm going to skip that section. And what we're going to do now is we want to install on the Windows. Use that section, which is part 2. So in part 2, there's two options. Option 1 is to use the FOSS-GIS install, 4W install. And what's nice about this option is that it gives you a shell command environment that you can utilize right off the install. So you don't have to configure your command prompt. You can just download everything, install it, and be up and running very quickly. And so this is great for, say, workshops or a situation where you just need to get it on the machine real fast and you're not really worried about tailoring it in any specific way. So we'll run through that. And then the second thing that we can do is we can use the GIS Internals support site to really tailor the install, the GDAL install. And I'll go through that as the second component. So let's go ahead and start with FOSS. So to get started here, we need to know if our machine is a 32-bit or a 62-bit machine. So we're going to have two different downloads depending on what the machine is. So one way you can figure out quickly what your machine is just do Windows X, and then you can go to Settings, and then from Settings you can go to System and just go to the About. And under the About, you should see your processor, your RAM, and then towards the bottom here it's going to have system type. So you can see that this is a 64-bit operating system, so x64 based processor. So we know that it's a 64. Most modern machines are going to be a 64. Okay, so I'm just going to click on the link to the installer, and here's the installer package. So we're going to go to the site here, and we're going to download the 64 version, so I'm just going to click on 64, and you can see it's downloads very quickly as an executable file. And we're going to go ahead and double click on that and say yes. And we're going to do the Express desktop install, and we need to pick a site. So any of these are probably going to work. I'm just going to do the download osgeo.org. And here's the trick here, is that if you want to install QGIS, you could do that. But for this guide tutorial, we're going to skip that and just do GDAL. And it gives me a warning because there's certain dependencies that it doesn't see that are currently loaded. So I want to install these packages to meet the dependencies. And these are all things that are required by GDAL to run. Okay, so we go ahead and say next and say I agree with the licensing and say next. And then it's going to install that package. And again, it's a nice install because it's creating its own working environment, which we'll show in just a second. So I'm just going to pause the video while everything extracts here and then start up when it's ready. Okay, the install takes approximately 3 to 5 minutes, and once you have a successful install, you just go ahead and click finish, and then we can see that it gives us a folder on our desktop. If we open up the folder, then it has a path to the shell, and we can just immediately get up and run. So let's just do a quick check of the version. So GDAL info, 2 dashes, version, and there it is. So this is the 2018 2.24, which is the latest version. So all set, super easy. And then of course you got the shell here. So that's option one. That's clean, nice, very simple and straightforward. The second option is where you tailor the actual GDAL install to work with your environment variables so that your command prompt can recognize the GDAL install. And you can tailor a little bit more with the second option here. So what we're going to do is under stable releases at GIS internal support site, we're going to figure out which version we should be using. There's several different versions. And what we need to know before we get too far along here is what's our compiler notation for Microsoft Visual C++. And the way that we can find out what we currently have installed is we can use win plus x, and then we're going to go to search and type in control panel, and then go to programs, and then under programs we want to go to programs and features. So 1 second here, and programs and features, and then we can see that we have all our Microsoft Visual C++ versions listed here in a long list. So the latest one looks like I have a 2017, and you can see it goes back a ways here also. So I have a 17 right now, so I can go ahead and work with 17 version. If your programs and features only showed, say, the 2015, you would go ahead and use that version. The other option here is you can download or you can update your Visual C++ environment. That's something that you can do. Okay. And we covered the system type also already, so we know that we're on a 64 machine right now. So let's go into our stable releases under GIS internals and figure out which one we want now. So the stable release that we're interested in for this particular machine is 2017 because I just checked it, and I know I'm on a 64-bit machine, so it's going to be this one. So I go ahead and click that, and then I get to this next window here that is a little bit daunting on first view, but what we're looking for are several key things. So we want to first make sure that we get the generic installer for GDAL core components, and there's some plugin options here. GDAL map server sources, compile binaries in a single zip. What we really want is we want to make sure that we are getting, to start here, we want to make sure that we're getting the core. So we just go ahead and click on that, and that's going to download. And then if we go back to our sheet here, the second thing that we need is we want to get our Python binding. So the Python binding is going to be .msi, and we have two versions here. We have 2.7 and 3.4. So you really got to think about, well, do I have a Python version already downloaded that I can utilize or not? So in this particular video, I'm going to download Python 3.4 in just a moment. So I'm going to go ahead and get the 3.4 version. So let's go back to the internal site, and I'm looking for, you can see them numbered out here. So this is the installer for GDAL Python bindings, and I want to make sure that I get the whatever version I'm working with. So in this case, I'm going to do 3.4. So I click on 3.4, and that downloads pretty quickly. And once I do that, then let's go ahead and go over to Python and get our correct Python downloads. So I say here, given that development is now stable in Python 3, it stands to reason to download the latest version, which is 3.4. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that. So if we go to Python downloads, these are all our releases, and I'm looking for 3.6, or no, 3.4, I'm sorry. So let's see if we can find it. There it is, 3.4.0. Go ahead and download that. And what's important here now is we come to all the different installer versions that we can utilize. So I know I'm on a 86 machine, so I want to make sure that I pick out the version that is for a, I'm sorry, not an 86, that's for a 64 machine. So we can see it right here. This is the -64 installer. So if you're on a 32, you're going to be using this one. So I click him. And once it's downloaded, I can go to my downloads folder, and it looks like I installed just prior. Get rid of that. So at this point, I should have the GDAL core. I should have my Python bindings. We just did the 4W setup, and then I should also have Python 3.4.0 for a 64-bit machine. Okay, so those are the parts that we need. So the first thing we want to do now is let's go ahead and install Python. So downloads, and go ahead and open up Python, run it, and say install for all users. That's fine. It's going to create a folder, so it's going to be Python 3.4, and it's going to put it in correctly and say yes. Take a little bit of time, and it shows us that it's installing, and it looks like it installed correctly, and say finish. So that's done, which is great. And if we want to check it, what we can do is we can access our command prompt and just make sure that we actually have that set up. So what I can do is I can go to Windows X and then go to search, and I can do command prompt that way. Or I could also go to Windows X and I could run and do CMD and say OK, and that gives me an option. I have a shell set up here that I'm going to use. So the way to do this now is to go over, and we want to check the resulting install directory. So we're going to simply use dir, which is directory, and then C Python 34, make sure it's in there. dir, and it shows it. So it's installed on the C drive in a folder called Python 34. So that's all set up. Okay, so Now, following the successful install of the appropriate Python version, we want to navigate to the download the GIS core and install followed by the Python binding. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that. Loads folder, and you can see here's the things that I had downloaded previously, and we've already installed Python. We want to go ahead and do the core now. So we run core, say next, and yours should be typical. So I had installed this previously. So here, when you get to this dialog, you should see typical and then custom. You just want to click on typical. So I'm just clicking because I've already installed it there. So you just run it. It installs very quickly, and then you say finish. And then after you do the core install based on typical, you're going to come into the binding itself and click on that, say run, install for all users, and Python 3.4 from the registry, that's correct, and say yes, and then say finish. And you've essentially installed all the components that we need at this point in time. So we've got Python, we got the core, and then we got the Python binding that we're going to need. So the next step is we need to establish path variables for command prompt. So right now, if I go to my command prompt and I look for a GDAL install, so in this case I'm just going to test the version. So if I go to GDAL info version, it's not going to recognize anything because the environment hasn't been established correctly. So we need to do that now. So the way to do that is we got two components that we need to do. We need to do two new variables, which are GDAL plugins and GDAL data. And we also need a system path variable for the GDAL folder itself. So all this is going to allow command prompt to be able to recognize all the things that it needs to run GDAL. To get to environmental variables, what we need to do is we need to just do a WinE and go into our actual computer. So we click on this PC or whatever you have your computer named and say properties. And under properties, there's advanced system settings. So we click on advanced system settings. And then we can go ahead and establish our environmental variables from this location here. So the first system variable we want to create is under path. So under path, we want to make sure that we're using either 32-bit or 64-bit. In this case, I'm using a 64-bit machine. So I'm going to use C program files GDAL. If I was using a 32-bit, I would go C program files parentheses x86 and then GDAL. So those are located there depending on your bit version. So I'm just going to copy this, and I'm going to add it under path, and it's going to, so under environment variables, I need to, under system variables, create a new path. So the first thing I do is go to path and say edit, and then down here at the bottom we can say new and simply paste it in there. So it should be ready now. So it's within path. And we say OK. Next thing we need to do is we need to set up a variable, a new system variable for the plugins and also for GDAL data. So the first thing is it's going to be, the name is going to be GDAL data. So I'm going to copy that, go to environmental variables, and I need to create a, under system variables, it doesn't have to be the path. I'm just going to say new, and the variable name I'm going to put in, and then the variable value is going to be our GDAL dash data. That's the first one. Say OK. And then we're going to do a new one. And this next one is going to be called GDAL driver path. And the path itself is to the plugins. And we're going to say OK. So they're in there. And then we also have our path system variable updated. So we should say OK. And we should be set. So we'll test it out here in a second and make sure that we got it correctly done. If you do have a fail, there's a decent chance that it happened in this last second step where somehow the naming wasn't correct or the file path structure wasn't determined correctly. So now we need to just test this, and we can test off command prompt. We can do winx and then run cmd. That'll get us into the command prompt, and then we're simply going to use GDAL info 2- version. So I already have my command prompt here. I'm just going to go ahead and test this out now. So I go to GDAL info version. And as long as I don't throw an error here and I can see the actual version and its release date, then everything should be ready to go. And at this point, you can go ahead and start using GDAL commands from the command prompt to work with spatial data.